keys seem so innocent until one lands with a metallic tap on your foot, right at your father's funeral. The weight of it, cold and unexpected, burrowed deeper than I could ever have imagined, straight into my chest, tearing something I didn't even know was still raw. Clutching that key, I could barely raise my head above the tide of condolences, just nodding in empty rhythm to voices fading somewhere beyond the fog of grief. I hid the key in my pocket, not realizing that it would open a door that would unmake what little pride my family had left. I was an ordinary wife and a nearly 60-year-old daughter of a man who prized dignity above all things. My husband Youngsu had grown up on blunt honesty, believing that the truth, no matter how rough, was always better than a well-kept facade. My father, by contrast, lived for appearances. For him, reputation was a shield and a prison. They clashed from the very first dinner. When Youngsu's small business ran aground after our wedding, my father's anger burned even hotter. He believed failure was a personal shame, one I should never have brought into the house. Youngsu, proud and stubborn in his own way, offered to repay every borrowed penny, but only in his time and on his terms. It was like watching two tall mountains shrouded in permanent clouds, refusing to make room for each other. Day after day, I found myself caught between the expectations of a daughter and the loyalty of a wife. The ground beneath me was always shifting. As a daughter, I tried to visit my father each week after my mother passed, but the coldness between him and my husband hung in the air like unspoken reproach, chilling the door handle each time I arrived. The more I tried to juggle both sides, the more exhausted and guilty I became. Eventually, I took a shortcut. Unable to face my father as often as duty demanded, I arranged for a service, a stranger to visit him twice a week, help with chores, do his shopping, take him to appointments. Each time I glanced at the calendar of service visits, I quieted my conscience for another 7 days. I never pretended those visits were truly mine, but the shadow of care was somehow enough to soothe the edges of guilt. Then, last winter, everything crashed down. My father's health failed suddenly. He collapsed, and I rushed to the hospital with Youngsu, always a silent presence at my side. My father never woke again. The faint smile in his framed photograph felt as thin and embattled as ever, nothing more than a brittle mask covering all we had failed to say to each other. Even after the funeral, there was little peace to be found. Loss only seemed to magnify the noise of old resentments. Tears barely dried before my siblings started arguing about money. My brother Dongho had borrowed from Dad many times, over turbulent years, running his fried chicken shop. My younger sister, Sanhi, always seemed on the edge. Credit card bills, tuition for her children, a permanent tightrope. At the very edge of the funeral corridor, they'd squabbled about who visited Dad the most, who received more money, whose debts weighed heavier. In the midst of their prickling words and blaming stares, I retreated further, feeling like a paper wall about to be torn in two. I promised myself it was finally time to close this endless chapter. A few days later, I returned to my father's now silent house and started going through his belongings, a process both tender and harsh. The threads of daily life remained tucked into old drawers, his favorite cup gathering dust, my mother's scent faintly lingering in the curtains. The photo albums brought back a time when problems seemed as simple as shoes too small or laughter that ended in tears. I noticed, harshly, that never once did my father and my husband share the same photo frame, as if that space between them was too wide to bridge. It was then, in the thin silence, that the memory of the key returned to me. The night before the burial, it had rattled against my foot, but only now did I search my pocket for it. I remembered my mother's old sewing box perched on the highest shelf. Sure enough, a dull metal lock begged for a key. The box creaked open to reveal an envelope, a ledger, and bank records, clues scattered among the last pages of my father's life. Regular withdrawals, notes for Dong-ho, and Sun-hee's medical needs and bills, mysterious initials, and one chilling absence. No mention of Young-soo's name anywhere. Did my father mean to erase him, or was this a secret kept deliberately hidden for other reasons? The more I uncovered, the more the sense of unfinished struggle grew. My hands shook as I tucked the record away, unsure whether it was a shield or a blade for battles with my siblings yet to come. Days flowed into nights. Arguments about inheritance bloomed in bitter volleys. And soon, my brother and sister started to question me directly. They wondered aloud why Dad's cash withdrawals increased, who the money really went to, and whether I'd benefited unfairly. Caught between layers of old distrust, I tried not to snap. At night, sleepless, I examined my own stack of service receipts, the ones I'd tucked away, and almost forgotten. The secret I harbored, my arrangement for the anonymous caretaker, was a silent rebuke I couldn't utter. It was easier to let suspicion grow than confess my own shortcuts. In this turmoil, a strange thread led me back to an old acquaintance, a school reunion that I had ignored for years. I needed a break, even an awkward one, from the relentless grind of family arguments and regrets. At the reunion, faces I hadn't seen since childhood drifted by, each bearing the weight of their own years. One of them, Jong-hee, recognized me across the room. She was no longer the quiet girl in the back row. I learned with a shock that she was actually connected to the service I had hired for my father. We exchanged a few words. I thanked her for her help with my father. She, carefully professional, let slip that the visits had been paused and quietly transitioned to family care long before I realized. This was odd. My payments had continued, but official visits had stopped much earlier than I thought. Apparently, someone close to Dad had stepped in for those final months, but for privacy reasons, Jong-hee couldn't say who. I drove home with my hands clenched, questions buzzing in my head. Who had been taking care of my father in my absence? Not me, certainly not my siblings. And then, returning once more to the empty house, I noticed something else missing. Dad's old fountain pen, always perched near his favorite drawer, was gone. A gentle pry at a seam in the wood, and I found a single folded letter pressed tight into the hidden gap. The letter broke my heart open in ways I hadn't braced for. In my father's thick handwriting, he revealed that without telling anyone, he had quietly begun meeting and accepting help from Young-soo, my husband. They had been quietly working together for months, maybe longer, as Do's health dwindled. My father admitted he had been too proud to tell me about any of it, not wanting to awaken old grudges. What pierced me most deeply was the gratitude my father expressed, not to me, but to Young-soo. He described how Young-soo came regularly on his own, repaired what needed fixing, took Dad to the hospital, and stayed, not just as an obligation, but as a real living presence. For so many years, while I ran from duty and comforted myself with paid services and distance. My husband had been present, where I should have been, not as anyone's shadow, but as himself. The fullness of my error, the icy wall I had built out of pride and assumption, pressed down so hard I could barely breathe. The letter was the twist I never saw coming. I had believed myself the victim, the only person balancing impossible duties between a father who never understood my husband and a husband who could never bend far enough for childish pride. But the truth was more complicated, more humbling, and much, much kinder. In my absence, young Sue had quietly bridged a gap I thought would never close. My mother's legacy, my father's dignity, my own fear of never being enough. A generation's worth of silence swept aside in their own private, unspoken truths. Real life rarely resolves with a single letter or a heartfelt glance. My siblings still protested the inheritance, arguing fiercely over Dad's final records. They each saw conspiracies, one accusing my husband of manipulation, another resenting any money not falling squarely into her hands. But the ledgers and my father's letter together painted a different picture, one meticulously honest, if not simple. My payments for the caregiver service had ended because young Sue was there, shouldering what I wouldn't, what I couldn't. Dad wrote that he left instructions. The house would pass to me, with some cash divided among my siblings and a donation to a local scholarship in both my parents' names. Strangely, a portion of the house sale would be set aside in a special fund under young Sue's name, meant for me if ever I truly needed help. The will was airtight, the numbers matched. No one could challenge honesty spelled out in that old, unmistakable handwriting. Still, my siblings' resentment would probably continue for years, echoing in awkward phone calls and tense holidays. But for the first time, the hush between us was something like peace, a truce forged by the strength of undeniable truth. At home, quietly, I sat with young Sue for a long time. All the questions I had, why he kept it secret, why he never told me about those evenings at my father's side, never made it to my lips. Instead, I reached out for his hand, my fingers trembling as they landed softly on his. For years, we'd lived side by side, each clinging to pride, keeping warmth at bay. It took my father's last kindnesses and my husband's silent endurance to show me what I had missed, the comfort of presence, the grace of forgiveness, the unspoken gestures that matter most. As I finished the last of the packing at my father's house, settling his old pen into my own desk drawer, I decided, quietly and firmly, that I would remember my loved ones for the warmth of their hands, not the face they presented to the world. Real dignity, I learned, lives not in pride or spotless reputations, but in the courage to love one another as we are, and to be truly present when it matters most. So here I am, on the other side of loss and discovery, asking you if you were standing at the door between pride and forgiveness, would you have the courage to reach for someone's hand first? Or would you wait until time made the choice for you?